Usually, when we talk about upgrading a computer, there's this very clear, like, impenetrable line between the physical hardware and the software.
Right, yeah, the physical and the digital.
Exactly. You have the silicon chips, the motherboard, the wiring, that's your hardware. And then you have the code, the operating system, the apps running on top of it, which is the software.
Hmm.
You don't just rewrite a line of code and suddenly watch your graphics card physically change shape.
No, of course not, because in traditional computing, those domains are totally isolated. I mean, a software update might make the system run a lot more efficiently, but it doesn't spawn new physical transistors on the motherboard.
Right, it's not magic.
Right.
But when you look at the human brain, and specifically when you step into the world of altered states, things like clinical hypnosis and mindfulness meditation, that line between hardware and software it completely vanishes.
It really does. It blurs to the point of not existing.
Yeah, your software actually starts physically rewriting your hardware, and the physical state of your hardware dictates what kind of software you can even run. So today we are looking at two massive and honestly very contrasting documents to figure out exactly how you can rewrite the structures inside your own head.
And it is an incredibly rich set of sources to dig into. On one side, we have this comprehensive, highly practical clinical manual.
It's basically a textbook, right?
Pretty much, yeah. It's essentially a field guide for practitioners of guided meditation and clinical hypnotherapy. It covers the history of these practices, the proposed neurobiology, and the actual, word-for-word clinical scripts they use to induce altered states in patients.
Which is a fascinating read on its own, but it makes some very bold claims about what the human mind is capable of, which is why our second source is so important here. We're also looking at this exhaustive, highly critical document called a strategic research plan.
Oh, and that one pulls absolutely no punches.
None at all. It systematically goes through all the claims made by clinical practitioners in the manual and just demands empirical, hard neurocognitive validation.
Yeah, the friction between these two sources is really what makes this deep dive so compelling. Because the clinical manual is sitting there saying, here is how you induce a trance, and look at these incredible psychological results.
Right.
And the research plan fires back and basically says, well, that is an interesting anecdote, but until you can show me the exact neurochemical pathway, the fMRI scan, and the actual mechanism of action proving it, it is just magic disguised as medicine.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to help you navigate this friction today. We're going to simplify this incredibly complex relationship between the brain and altered states.
That's the goal.
Yeah, by the end of this conversation, we're going to decode the basics of neuroplasticity so perfectly that, honestly, if you were a high school or college student taking a final exam on this tomorrow, you would absolutely ace it.
Guaranteed.
We are going to do that by mapping out the difference between the what we call the bottom-up structural changes created by meditation and the top-down active changes created by hypnosis.
And that distinction, bottom-up structural change versus top-down functional change, that is the absolute key to understanding everything we're about to discuss today.
But before we can talk about software upgrades or, hacking the system, we need to establish the baseline. We need to introduce the cast of characters inside your skull. So let's start with the most fundamental concept in our sources. What exactly do we mean when we use the word neuroplasticity?
Well, to understand neuroplasticity, you kind of have to understand what scientists used to believe first.
The old dogma.
Exactly. For the vast majority of the 20th century, the prevailing dogma in neuroscience was that the adult human brain was just a static, fixed organ. The assumption was that you had this critical period of development in childhood where the brain was highly malleable.
Like wet cement.
Right, like wet cement. But once you reached your mid-20s, the concrete basically set. You had the neurons you were going to have, the pathways were completely locked in, and from that point on, it was just a slow, inevitable process of cognitive decline and cellular death.
Which is just an incredibly depressing way to view human potential, honestly. You're essentially just a machine slowly breaking down until you die.
It's very bleak. But with the advent of advanced neuroimaging in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, that dogma was completely shattered. Neuroplasticity is the discovery that the brain actually maintains the ability to reorganize itself, to form new neural connections and even generate new neurons throughout your entire life.
So it stays plastic.
Yes, it is highly malleable, and crucially, it is experience dependent.
Experience dependent meaning what I do on a daily basis actually dictates the physical shape of the organ.
Precisely. There is this famous axiom in neuroscience, it's often attributed to the psychologist Donald Hebb. He said, neurons that fire together wire together.
Fire together, wire together. I love that.
It's a great shorthand. Every time you learn a new skill, harbor a specific thought pattern, or react to a stressful situation, electrical signals travel down specific pathways in your brain. If you repeat that experience over and over, the brain recognizes the pattern and physically reinforces that pathway.
So it builds better infrastructure for the stuff you do a lot.
Exactly. It adds myelin, which is this fatty insulating sheath around the axon of the neuron to make the signal travel faster. It grows new dendritic spines to connect to neighboring neurons. The architecture literally physically changes based on where you direct your attention.
Okay, so the brain is plastic. It is moldable. To understand how meditation and hypnosis actively mold it, let's introduce the 3 specific brain regions that our sources focus on today. Kind of the stars of the show.
Yeah, let's lay them out.
Region number 1, the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. I like to think of this as the CEO of the brain.
That is a highly accurate analogy, actually. Specifically, when we look at the neuroimaging in our sources, we are often talking about a subregion called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC.
Okay, the DLPFC. Where is that?
Geographically, it sits right behind your forehead. Evolutionarily speaking, it is the newest part of the human brain, and it takes the absolute longest to fully develop. It often doesn't reach maturity until you are about 25 years old.
And what exactly does the CEO do on a day-to-day basis in there?
It is the seat of your executive function. When you are doing complex cognitive processing, when you are exercising impulse control, when you are engaging in logical linear thought or planning for the future, that is your CEO at work.
So it's the responsible one.
Very much so. If you feel the urge to eat an entire chocolate cake, but you stop yourself because you are thinking about your long-term health goals, that is the prefrontal cortex overriding your more primitive impulses. It is the highest level of conscious, deliberate control you possess.
Okay, so the CEO sits in the front office making the logical decisions. That brings us to character number 2, the amygdala. If the prefrontal cortex is the CEO, I view the amygdala as the security alarm.
The security alarm is a great way to conceptualize it, and you actually have 2 amygdalae, one in each hemisphere of the brain, nestled deep down within the temporal lobes. They are these tiny, almond-shaped clusters of nuclei.
And what's their job?
Their primary job is to process emotional responses, particularly fear, anxiety, and threat detection.
How does the security alarm interact with the CEO? Are they, like, talking to each other?
They are constantly communicating, but they operate at very, very different speeds. Let's say you encounter a potential threat. Say you are walking in the woods and you see a long, curved shape on the ground.
A snake.
Right. Visual data hits your retina and goes into your brain. The amygdala processes that data instantly, recognizes a snake-like shape, and immediately sounds the alarm. Within milliseconds, before you are even consciously aware of what you are actually looking at, the amygdala triggers the fight-or-flight response.
Wow, so it bypasses the conscious mind entirely.
Completely. It signals the release of cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream, your heart rate spikes, your muscles tense up.
So the alarm goes off before the CEO even has the paperwork on their desk.
Exactly. It is a primal survival mechanism. It takes slightly longer for that exact same visual data to reach the prefrontal cortex. When it finally does, the CEO analyzes the shape, realizes it is just a curved stick, and sends an inhibitory signal back down to the amygdala to turn the alarm off.
Stand down, it's just a stick.
Exactly. The security alarm doesn't care about logic or nuance. It just cares about keeping you alive. So it is fast, highly reactive, and very sensitive.
Which brings us to our third and final character, the insula. Sticking with our analogies, I think of the insula as the internal diagnostics app.
The insula is fascinating, and honestly, it often gets overlooked in popular science discussions. It is a portion of the cerebral cortex folded deep within the lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobes. Basically, it is an integration center.
What exactly is it integrating?
It integrates your internal physical state with your conscious emotional experience. So we are all familiar with exteroception, processing the outside world through sight, sound, touch. But the insula is the hub for interoception.
Interoception, so feeling inside the body.
Yes. Interoception is how you perceive your internal bodily sensations. When you feel your heart racing in your chest, when you feel the flutter of butterflies in your stomach before a public speech, or when you feel the physical sensation of pain from a stubbed toe, all that raw sensory data is routed directly to the insula.
So it's basically the dashboard reading the engine temperature and the tire pressure.
Yes, but it actually goes a step further than that. It doesn't just read the data. It attaches emotional salience to it.
Meaning what?
Meaning it takes the physical sensation of a racing heart and, depending on the context, labels it as either exciting or terrifying. It bridges the gap between the physiological body and the psychological mind.
Okay, so we have the CEO making the logical plans, the security alarm scanning for threats, and the diagnostics app monitoring the physical state of the body. Based on our sources, the central thesis of our entire discussion today revolves around how altered states manipulate these three specific regions.
That's the core of it.
Right. And the core argument is this: meditation alters these brain regions via passive, bottom-up structural changes over long periods of time. But hypnosis alters them via active, top-down functional overrides in real time.
That is the crucial distinction we really need to unpack for the listener. We are looking at two completely different mechanisms for hacking the exact same neurological hardware.
So let's start with the slow structural remodeling process, the bottom-up upgrade. How does sitting still and focusing on your breath literally rebuild the brain?
Well, to understand the modern clinical view of meditation, our sources point us back to 1979 and a man named John Kabat-Zinn. Kabat-Zinn was a molecular biologist trained at MIT, and he recognized a really profound problem in Western medicine at the time.
What was the problem?
Doctors were very, very good at treating acute illnesses, setting a broken bone, prescribing antibiotics for a severe infection, but they were terrible at treating chronic stress-related conditions. Patients were suffering from chronic pain, hypertension, severe anxiety, and the medical system had very few tools to actually offer them.
And Kabat-Zinn was also a practitioner of Zen Buddhism and Vipassana meditation, right?
Yes, he was. He knew from personal experience that these ancient contemplative practices were incredibly effective at managing psychological suffering. But he also knew that if he walked into a hospital in the late 70s and told doctors to prescribe Zen Buddhism to their patients, he would be laughed right out of the room.
Yeah, doctors aren't going to prescribe enlightenment.
Exactly. The religious and mystical baggage of those traditions made them totally unpalatable to the Western scientific establishment.
So he did something brilliant. He stripped away the mysticism, removed all the religious terminology, and packaged the core mechanics of meditation into a secular 8-week clinical program called mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR.
Right. He turned a spiritual pursuit into a standardized, scientifically testable protocol. MBSR primarily involves training the mind to sustain non-judgmental present moment awareness. You just focus on your breath or the sensations in your body, and when your mind inevitably wanders, you gently button your attention back without criticizing yourself.
And because Kabat-Zinn standardized this 8-week process, neuroscientists suddenly had a controlled variable they could study in a laboratory setting.
Exactly. And that brings us to the Harvard research heavily featured in the clinical manual. This is where the narrative completely shifts from subjective feelings of just, relaxation to hard objective neurobiology. We are talking about the work of Dr. Sarah Lazar.
Dr. Lazar's research was groundbreaking because she didn't just rely on self-reported questionnaires asking people how stressed they felt.
No, she put them in MRI machines. Specifically, her team utilized a neuroimaging technique called voxel-based morphometry, or VBM.
How does VBM work compared to a normal brain scan? I think most people just picture a glowing brain.
Right, so a standard MRI gives you a very high-resolution picture of the brain's anatomy. But VBM takes that anatomical data and uses complex software algorithms to measure the exact volume, density, and concentration of gray matter in specific regions down to the voxel level.
And a voxel is like a 3D pixel.
Correct, exactly. It's basically a three-dimensional pixel. So VBM allows researchers to look at the brain and say, in this specific millimeter of tissue, is there more or less neuronal density than there was 2 months ago?
So they are measuring the literal physical thickness of the hardware.
Yes. Lazar's team took a group of highly stressed individuals who had never meditated before in their lives. They scanned their brains using VBM to get a baseline. Then they put these subjects through Kabat-Zinn's 8-week MBSR program.
How much were they meditating?
They practiced mindfulness meditation for about 40 minutes a day, and after 8 weeks, they put them back in the MRI machine and scanned them again.
And what did they find when they compared the before and after scans?
The results were just staggering. Let's look at our cast of characters. We'll start with the amygdala, the security alarm. After just 8 weeks of mindfulness practice, the amygdala actually physically shrunk.
Wait, it got smaller.
Yes. The gray matter density in that specific region decreased significantly.
That is such a counterintuitive concept. I mean, when we learn a new skill, we usually assume the brain grows. Like you get smarter, your brain gets bigger. But you're saying that by sitting quietly and repeatedly focusing on the breath, these people eroded the physical mass of their fear center.
They did, and we have to connect this back to neuroplasticity and Hebb's law. If neurons that fire together wire together, the inverse is also true. Neurons that fire apart wire apart.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, when you are constantly stressed, constantly ruminating on past regrets or future anxieties, your amygdala is firing constantly. It is getting a massive metabolic workout, so it builds denser connections to handle the load.
Lifting weights all day.
Right. But during mindfulness meditation, you are actively training your mind to disengage from those stressful narratives. You are observing your thoughts without reacting to them. Because the amygdala is firing less frequently over those 8 weeks, the brain recognizes that this extra hardware is no longer necessary.
So it just gets rid of it.
Basically. Through a process called synaptic pruning, it begins to dismantle the excess connections, physically shrinking the volume of the region.
What did that physical shrinkage actually mean for the people in the study? Did they just feel less fear?
The structural shrinkage directly correlated with their self-reported reduction in perceived stress. Now, it doesn't mean they became emotionless robots, right? If a car swerved into their lane, their amygdala still fired. But the baseline sensitivity was downregulated.
And the alarm wasn't as loud?
Exactly. The alarm bell wasn't as loud, and it didn't stay ringing for hours after the stressful event had passed. They had a much, much faster physiological recovery time.
So the security alarm shrinks. What happens to the CEO in the diagnostics app? What happens to the prefrontal cortex in the insula?
They experience the exact opposite effect. While the amygdala shrinks, the prefrontal cortex and the insula experience significant cortical thickening. The neural networks in these regions become significantly denser.
Because they are the regions doing all the heavy lifting during the meditation.
Precisely. Think about it. The act of noticing that your mind has wandered and then deliberately pulling your attention back to the breath that requires intense executive control from the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
And noticing the physical sensation of the breath entering and leaving the body relies heavily on the insula's interoceptive network. So it is a literal workout for those regions. Furthermore, the clinical manual notes that long-term meditation leads to increased gyrification.
Gyrification. Okay, that refers to the actual folds and wrinkles on the outside of the brain.
Yes. The human cerebral cortex is highly folded. If you were to take a human cortex and somehow lay it out flat, it would be about the size of an extra large pizza. Yeah. So to fit all that surface area inside the limited volume of the human skull, the brain fills in on itself, creating those iconic ridges and valleys, which are called gyri and sulci.
And more folds is a good thing.
Yes, the more folds you have, the more surface area you have, which means you can pack more neurons into the exact same space. It makes cognitive processing faster and more efficient. And the research shows that long-term meditators have significantly more cortical folding in their prefrontal and insular regions compared to non-meditators.
So they are essentially increasing their brain's processing power and bodily awareness just by managing their attention. That's wild. The manual also highlights the left hippocampus, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. The hippocampus is this seahorse-shaped structure that's critical for learning, memory consolidation, and spatial navigation. It is also highly involved in regulating emotional responses and maintaining context.
And what happened to it?
In the MBSR studies, the left hippocampus also showed significant increases in gray matter density.
Okay, let me push back on this for a second, because the research plan raises a very valid skeptical point about these longitudinal studies. The brain naturally changes as we age, regardless of what we do.
Sure.
The cortex normally thins out, we lose gray matter, our memory degrades. How do the researchers know that these structural changes are actually caused by meditation and not just, I don't know, natural fluctuations, or perhaps the fact that these people were just taking time out of their busy days to relax?
That is a very critical question, and it is exactly why the control groups in these studies are so important. When you compare meditators to age-matched controls, the data is just undeniable. It is not just normal aging. In fact, long-term meditation appears to offset the natural age-related atrophy of the brain.
Offset it completely.
In some cases, yes. The research plan notes that in some cross-sectional studies, 50-year-old long-term meditators had the exact same amount of prefrontal cortex gray matter volume as 25-year-old non-meditators.
That is incredible. They essentially halted the physical aging process of their executive function.
They built a profound neurological reserve. And you cannot achieve that structural preservation just by taking a nap or reading a book on the couch. It requires the active, sustained mental effort of focused attention.
So to synthesize this first half of the equation for you listening, we call this bottom-up change because it is a foundational structural process. When you meditate, you aren't actively trying to fix a specific trauma. You aren't trying to cure a phobia of spiders. You are simply practicing broadened, non-judgmental, present moment awareness.
Exactly. It is highly analogous to physical exercise. I mean, you don't go to the gym and do deadlifts because you have a specific heavy box you need to move later that afternoon, right?
Right.
You do deadlifts to slowly, methodically fortify your muscular architecture. You build the hardware so that weeks or months later, when life presents you with a heavy burden, your body naturally has the structural capacity to handle it without injury. Meditation fortifies the neurological hardware so that the brain naturally reacts to future stressors with a calmer, more measured response.
It is a phenomenal tool, but it has a major limitation. It requires time. It takes 8 weeks of daily practice just to see the initial structural changes. What happens if you don't have 8 weeks?
Right.
What if you are having a severe panic attack right now? What if you need to undergo painful surgery tomorrow and you have a lethal allergy to chemical anesthesia? Meditation might help you manage the anxiety of the upcoming surgery, but it isn't going to stop you from feeling the scalpel. If you need to change how the brain processes reality in the next 4 minutes, bottom-up structural change is just too slow.
And that is exactly where we transition from the slow hardware upgrade to the immediate software override.
Which brings us to the most contested, heavily debated topic in our source material: hypnosis, the top-down intervention. Now, before we get into the modern brain scans that explain how hypnosis works, we really have to look at the history because for almost the entire 20th century, the scientific community was engaged in this bitter civil war over whether hypnosis even existed.
Oh, the state versus non-state debate. It is one of the most contentious, aggressively argued periods in the history of clinical psychology.
The manual lays out the two opposing camps. On one side, you had the state theorists, championed by people like Dr. Ernest Hilgard. What was Hilgard's central argument?
Hilgard proposed the neo-dissociation theory. He argued that hypnosis induces a genuine, neurologically distinct, altered state of consciousness. He believed that when a person enters a deep trance, the hypnosis creates a literal division in their executive control, what he called an amnesic barrier.
An amnesic barrier meaning the brain is cordoning off certain information from conscious awareness.
Exactly. Hilgard famously conducted experiments involving ice water. He would hypnotize a highly suggestible subject, give them a suggestion that they would feel absolutely no pain, and then have them submerge their hand in a bucket of freezing ice water.
Which hurts.
A lot. Normally, this becomes excruciatingly painful within seconds. The hypnotized subjects, however, would just sit there calmly, reporting zero pain. But Hilgard theorized that the pain wasn't actually gone, it was just hidden.
How did he test that?
He asked the subjects to use their non-submerged hand to press a button or write on a piece of paper if some hidden part of them was experiencing the pain. And remarkably, while the subject consciously reported feeling fine, their other hand would furiously write, "It hurts! Take it out!"
That is so creepy.
It is. Hilgard called this the hidden observer. He argued this proved the amnesic barrier was real, the brain was processing the extreme pain, but the hypnotic state prevented that pain data from reaching conscious awareness.
So Hilgard says it is a profound, unique state of altered consciousness. But then you have the other side of the war. The non-state or sociocognitive theorists, like Nicholas Spanos and Irving Kirsch, and they looked at Hilgard's work and basically said, this is entirely theatrical nonsense.
Pretty much. They rejected the idea of a special trance state entirely. Spanos argued that everything we observe during hypnosis can be explained by standard psychological principles: intense social compliance, response expectancy, and highly motivated role-playing.
So they thought the subjects with their hands in the ice water were just faking it.
Well, not necessarily consciously faking it with malicious intent, but engaging in deep, motivated imagination. Spanos pointed out that the context of hypnosis carries immense social pressure. You are in a laboratory. A doctor in a white lab coat speaks to you in a highly authoritative tone.
You want to be a good subject.
Exactly. You want to please the researcher. So when the doctor tells you your arm is numb, you actively use your imagination to focus on anything other than the cold water. You convince yourself it doesn't hurt because you expect it shouldn't hurt based on the doctor's suggestion. Spanos argued there was no amnesic barrier, just a person highly motivated to follow instructions and ignore their own discomfort.
It is a massive philosophical divide.
Yeah.
Are these people in a distinct, measurable neurophysiological trance, or are they just highly compliant actors playing a role expected of them? For decades, you had brilliant scientists yelling at each other, publishing conflicting papers, and unable to reach a consensus. And what finally settled the debate wasn't a better psychological theory. It was the invention of functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Yes, the fMRI scanner finally provided the objective data needed to settle the argument once and for all. And this is where the clinical manual points us to the landmark research of Dr. David Spiegel at Stanford University.
How does an fMRI differ from the VBM scans we talked about with meditation?
So VBM measures structure the physical volume of gray matter over time. fMRI measures function in real time. It detects changes in blood oxygenation and flow that occur in response to neural activity. When a specific area of the brain becomes more active, it requires more oxygen, so blood flow to that region increases.
Right.
The fMRI can track these blood flow changes moment by moment, allowing researchers to see exactly which networks are communicating while a subject is performing a task.
So Spiegel takes highly hypnotizable people, puts them in the fMRI, and induces a clinical trance while watching their blood flow. What does he find?
He found definitive, undeniable proof that hypnosis is a distinct, measurable neurological state. It is absolutely not just role-playing or social compliance. You cannot consciously fake the blood flow patterns that Spiegel observed.
Let's break down those patterns. The sources outline 3 distinct functional hallmarks that happen in real time when someone enters a hypnotic trance. Hallmark number 1, decreased activity in the DACC. What is the DACC and why does its activity drop?
The DACC stands for the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. It is a critical node in what neuroscientists call the brain's salience network.
The salience network. Salience meaning what is important or prominent in the environment.
Exactly. Your salience network is constantly running in the background, scanning your environment and your internal state, deciding what stimuli deserve your conscious attention. If you are reading a book in a coffee shop and someone drops a glass, your salience network immediately shifts your attention to the crash to determine if it is a threat. It is the neurological filter for reality.
Okay, got it.
When a subject goes into deep hypnosis, activity in the DACC plummets.
The filter just shuts down. My favorite analogy for this is that it's like putting on extreme military-grade noise-canceling headphones.
Yeah.
All the peripheral anxiety, the worrying about what you look like, the ticking of the clock in the background, the awareness of the MRI scanner clanking around you, it all just drops away. The brain stops scanning the room for threats, which allows for a laser-like, hyper-focused attention on the hypnotist's voice.
That suspension of environmental vigilance is the first necessary step for trance. Now, hallmark number 2 is where the true power of hypnosis is revealed. The fMRI shows increased functional connectivity between the DLPFC and the insula.
Okay, translating that back to our cast of characters.
Yeah.
The CEO is suddenly establishing a direct, high-speed, fiber-optic connection to the internal diagnostics app.
Precisely. This is the ultimate top-down control mechanism. Under normal waking conditions, the insula receives sensory data from the body and automatically attaches emotional significance to it. But during hypnosis, because the CEO is hyper-connected to the insula, the conscious mind is able to actively modulate and dictate how the body processes that somatic experience in real time.
So this is how hypnotic analgesia works. This is how people undergo major medical procedures like dental extractions or even tumor removals using only hypnosis instead of chemical anesthesia.
Yes. It explains Hilgard's ice water experiments perfectly. When the scalpel cuts the skin, the peripheral nervous system still fires. The nociceptors in the tissue send a physical pain signal up the spinal cord and into the brain. The physical sensation definitely happens.
Right, the hardware is working.
But because the prefrontal cortex is heavily overriding the insula, the CEO essentially tells the diagnostics app, look, we are receiving a massive sensory signal from the arm, but we are choosing not to attach any emotional suffering, distress, or panic to it.
That is mind-blowing. The hardware is actively sending an emergency pain signal, but the software steps in and rewrites how that signal is interpreted. It severs the neurological link between nociception, which is the physical feeling of pain, and suffering the emotional reaction to pain.
It proves that pain is not just a biological given. It is a constructed experience that can be deconstructed through focused attention.
Which brings us to hallmark number 3, and this might be the most critical one for psychological therapy and behavior change. Decoupling from the default mode network, or the DMN.
The default mode network is a massive, highly interconnected series of brain regions. It's primarily centered in the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex.
And it's called the default mode because it's what runs when we're just sitting there.
Exactly. It's highly active when you are at rest. When you aren't focused on a specific external task, your brain defaults to this network.
What is the brain doing when it's just defaulting?
It engages in mental time travel, it ruminates on the past, it worries about the future, it engages in self-referential thought. It is essentially the neurological basis of your ego, your self-consciousness, and your autobiographical narrative.
It's the inner critic. It's the voice in your head that tells you you aren't good enough, the voice that tells you that you need a cigarette to cope with stress, the voice that judges everything you do.
Exactly. Under normal conditions, your executive control network is tightly coupled with the DMN. Every decision you make is filtered through that critical, self-referential lens. But Spiegel's fMRI scans showed that during hypnosis, the executive control network completely unplugs from the DMN. It physically decouples.
It's like turning off the Wi-Fi in your laptop so your internet troll can't post negative comments while you try to fix the operating system.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. Because the DMN is offline, the subject's critical faculty and self-judgment are suspended. If a therapist tells a normal, waking person who has smoked for 20 years, you're a non-smoker, the DMN immediately fires up and says, "That's a lie, I love cigarettes, I failed quitting 3 times."
Right, it fights back.
The suggestion is blocked by cognitive friction. But in hypnosis, because the DMN is unplugged, the therapist can input that new software suggestion, you no longer crave cigarettes, and it is accepted by the subconscious processing centers without the usual resistance.
So we have meditation building up the structural hardware slowly from the bottom up, and hypnosis actively hacking the functional software instantly from the top down. Our sources map these two paradigms out beautifully. They seem perfectly complementary, but this is exactly where the strategic research plan busts into the room and points out a massive scientific blind spot.
Yes. The clinical manual presents hypnosis and meditation in entirely separate chapters, treating them as completely distinct modalities with very different end goals. The manual assumes hypnosis is strictly for short-term functional change, and meditation is strictly for long-term structural change. But the research plan demands that we synthesize them.
Because if you look at the brain scans, they're targeting the exact same neurological real estate.
Exactly. Both modalities are heavily modulating the default mode network, the insula, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala. The research plan raises a really profound question. If I'm working on the same hardware, where do these two processes overlap?
What are the specific questions the researchers want answered?
Well, the research plan asks, if a patient undergoes long-term routine hypnotherapy every single day for months, does that repeated functional decoupling eventually harden into the same structural brain thickening, that gyrification that we see after 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation? Does the top-down software eventually rewrite the bottom-up hardware?
And conversely, if a complete novice sits down to do a 20-minute guided meditation, are they utilizing the exact same functional DMN decoupling that Spiegel observed in a deep clinical hypnosis session? Is a deep meditation actually just self-hypnosis?
We don't fully know yet. The scientific literature hasn't bridged that gap. And that is exactly what Phase I of the strategic research plan is designed to figure out.
The plan outlines a massive, proposed 12-month longitudinal study to finally synthesize these fields. How are they going to do it?
They want to run parallel neuroimaging tracks. They plan to take a cohort of long-term MBSR meditators and a cohort of patients undergoing frequent hypnotherapy. They will compare real-time 3T fMRI scans of patients in acute hypnosis against the voxel-based morphometry of the meditating patients. The objective is to track the exact timeline of when a functional change, the blood flow, converts into a structural change, the gray matter density.
And they're also aiming to solve the neurochemistry of pain control, right?
Yeah.
They mentioned using real-time PET scanning.
Yes. Positron emission tomography. PET scans use radioactive tracers to track the actual metabolism of specific neurotransmitters in the brain. The research plan argues that the fMRI only shows us blood flow. It doesn't show us the underlying chemistry.
Right, it doesn't show the chemicals.
Exactly. When someone feels no pain during hypnotic surgery, we know the DLPFC and the insula are connected, but what chemicals are mediating that connection? Is the brain flooding the system with endogenous opioids like natural endorphins?
Or is it something else entirely?
The alternative hypothesis in the research plan is that it might be a localized spike in GABA. GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It acts as the biological brake pedal.
Okay.
When GABA binds to a neuron, it hyperpolarizes the cell, making it incredibly difficult for that neuron to fire an electrical signal. The plan hypothesizes that the prefrontal cortex might be commanding a massive release of GABA directly into the somatosensory cortex, literally shutting down the neurons responsible for processing touch and pain.
I love how relentless the research plan is. It refuses to accept it just works as an answer. But here is the reality. While the neuroscientists are busy preparing their multi-million-dollar scanners and radioactive tracers to figure out the exact chemical pathways, clinical hypnotherapists are out in the real world right now, successfully triggering these top-down overrides every single day.
It's true.
They don't have scalpels and they don't have chemical anesthesia. They only have their voices. So the million-dollar question is, how do mere words spoken by a therapist physically trigger that neurological decoupling?
That transitions us from the theoretical neuroscience into the practical application. How do you actually hack the system?
Let's look at the methodology detailed in the clinical manual. It starts before the formal trance even begins, with something called suggestibility testing. And the manual provides a very famous, very effective test called the Lemon test. I want you, the listener, to try this with us right now. I want you to experience the bridge between your thoughts and your biology. Unless you're driving, close your eyes.
Yeah, please don't do this if you're driving.
Right. But if you're safe, close your eyes. I want you to vividly imagine holding a perfect, heavy, yellow, slightly chilled lemon. Feel the dimpled, waxy texture of the rind in your palm. Now imagine putting it down on a wooden cutting board, taking a heavy, sharp chef's knife and slicing it right down the middle. Hear the sound of the knife crunching through the rind. See the juice spray up into the air and bead on the board. Smell that intense, sharp, acidic citrus scent. Now, pick up one of those wet lemon wedges, bring it right up to your mouth, and take a massive bite out of the flesh.
Now, pause and reflect on what just happened in your mouth.
If you are like the vast majority of people, your mouth just watered. You probably just swallowed a rush of saliva. You might have even felt a sharp tingling sensation in your jaw. Wipe your mouth and think about the implications of that for a second. There is no lemon, but your physical body reacted as if there were.
From a clinical perspective, the manual explains that this test helps the hypnotist identify a subject's dominant neuro-linguistic preference. The clinician is watching your reaction to see if you process the world primarily through visual, auditory, or kinesthetic pathways.
Right. If you didn't see the lemon very clearly, but the imaginary sound of the knife crunching made you wince, the hypnotist knows you are highly auditory. They will tailor their induction script to use sound-based metaphors.
But the research plan, as always, pushes us deeper. It points out the profound neurobiological reality of why you just salivated. When you consciously construct the image of a lemon, you are activating your visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Your salivation is controlled by autonomic regulatory centers located in the brainstem, specifically the salivatory nuclei in the medulla.
The medulla handles the involuntary stuff.
Right. You cannot consciously command the medulla to secrete saliva. Try it right now. Tell your mouth to water without imagining food. You can't do it.
But the imagination bridges the gap.
Exactly. The fact that you salivated to an imaginary lemon proves that there is a hyper-connected pathway in your brain between your conscious visualization centers and your involuntary autonomic nervous system. The lemon test isn't just a parlor trick. It is a demonstration to the patient. You just proved to your own brain that your conscious thoughts can instantly control your involuntary biology.
Once a subject realizes that, the resistance drops, and they are primed for the actual induction. And when we look at direct, rapid inductions, the source manual points to the undisputed gold standard for medical hypnosis, the Dave Elman induction.
Dave Elman was a pioneer in the mid-20th century. He was a radio host and a stage hypnotist who eventually trained thousands of physicians and dentists. He developed a highly structured, highly reliable technique to achieve deep medical-grade trance in under 4 minutes.
Under 4 minutes to completely decouple the default mode network, it sounds impossible. Elman laid out specific sequential steps, but the clinical manual just provides the script. The research plan demands we explain the mechanistics. So, step by step, how does Elman crash the CEO's operating system?
Step 1 of the Elman induction is establishing eyelid catalepsy. The hypnotist asks the subject to close their eyes and relax the tiny muscles around their eyelids so deeply that they simply won't work. Once the subject has achieved that profound relaxation, the hypnotist gives a command. Hold on to that relaxation and try to open your eyes.
Wait, you're telling them to relax the muscles and simultaneously telling them to use the muscles to open their eyes?
Precisely. This is a classic therapeutic double bind. The subject is given a conscious command from the CEO. Try to open your eyes. But they're also holding a subconscious physiological directive. Maintain total muscle relaxation.
And the brain cannot do both simultaneously.
It creates profound cognitive dissonance. The brain hates dissonance. It requires internal consistency. It has to resolve the conflict. Because the physical relaxation is already established, when the subject tries to open their eyes, the muscles fail. They flutter, but they stay shut.
That's the catalepsy.
Yes. This localized physical failure catalepsy convinces the critical faculty that something profound is happening. The CEO says, I told the eyes to open and they didn't, therefore I must be hypnotized. That realization rapidly deepens the trance state and begins the decoupling process.
The resistance begins to crumble. That moves us to step 2, vote fractionation. The hypnotist instructs the subject to open and close their eyes repeatedly, telling them that every time they close their eyes, they will drop 10 times deeper into relaxation.
The clinical manual refers to this using a psychological term called homoaction, which is the tendency of the mind to repeat a specific behavior more easily and deeply with each iteration. But the research plan gives us the harsh neurological reality of what is actually happening. It is rapid state switching.
State switching meaning shifting from alert to relaxed.
Yes. The hypnotist forces the subject to go from external alertness, where the eyes are open and processing the room, to internal relaxation, where the eyes are closed and processing somatic sensation over and over every few seconds.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. This rapid toggling requires massive amounts of glucose and oxygen. It causes intense metabolic fatigue in the prefrontal cortex. You are literally exhausting the CEO's energy reserves. When the prefrontal cortex runs out of the energy required to constantly reorient to waking reality, it gives up. It essentially says, this is too much work, and forces the brain to rely on the less energy-intensive default state of deep trance.
You are tiring the security guard out until he falls asleep at the front desk. Which brings us to the final, most crucial hurdle of the Elman induction. Step 3, the number block. The hypnotist tells the subject to start counting backward from 100 out loud, but commands them to relax their minds so completely that the numbers will fade away and disappear completely by the time they reach 97.
And this is widely misunderstood in popular culture. When the subject hits 98 and then falls silent, people think it's genuine amnesia, that the hypnotist has magically erased the concept of numbers from their memory.
Right, like they forgot how to count.
But the research plan clarifies that this is absolutely not amnesia. It is a suggestion-induced suppression of the working memory buffers.
How does that actually work mechanically?
Your prefrontal cortex has a working memory buffer, kind of like RAM in a computer that holds temporary information. To count backwards, you have to hold the current number in your RAM, subtract 1, and then articulate the new number using your brain's expressive language center, specifically Broca's area.
So it takes significant processing power just to count down.
Exactly. The hypnotist is already demanding that the subject maintain profound physical and mental relaxation. The cognitive load of trying to sustain that relaxation while simultaneously performing mathematical subtraction in the working memory buffer and formulating speech in Broca's area, it simply crashes the system.
The RAM fills up.
The numbers vanish because the working memory buffer is intentionally overloaded and cleared by the subject to alleviate the cognitive friction. It is temporary aphasia, not amnesia.
In under 4 minutes, through cognitive dissonance, metabolic fatigue, and working memory overload, the CEO is completely taken offline. The DMN is decoupled. It's a brilliant, forceful hack. It really is. But Elman's method is very direct. It's highly authoritarian. Relax your eyes, test them, count backward. What if you have a client who is highly resistant, a CEO who is stubborn, analytical, and refuses to leave the office? If you tell them to relax, their inner critic immediately says, "Don't tell me what to do." How do you hack a brain that fights back?
That leads us to the other end of the clinical spectrum. We move from the direct assault to the covert operation. We have to talk about Dr. Milton H. Erickson, the linguistic ninja.
Erickson is an absolute legend in the source material. He was an American psychiatrist who completely revolutionized hypnotherapy by abandoning direct commands entirely. If Elman was a sledgehammer, Erickson was a lockpick. He used metaphor, storytelling, and incredibly complex, indirect language patterns to induce trance.
The clinical manual details his specific language patterns, which his students later codified as the Milton model. It is the foundation of conversational hypnosis. But once again, the research plan steps in to demystify the magic. It explains the mechanics of Erickson's language by looking at how his syntax manipulates cognitive load. And the plan notes this can actually be measured objectively in a lab using pupillometry.
Pupillometry, measuring the dilation of the pupil in the eye.
Yes. When your brain is working hard to process complex information, your sympathetic nervous system activates slightly, causing your pupils to dilate. By tracking pupil dilation, researchers can measure exactly how much cognitive load a specific sentence places on a listener's prefrontal cortex.
Let's look at the linguistic tools that cause that cognitive overload. The first is a variation of the double bind. But Erickson didn't use it to create physical catalepsy like Elman did. He used it to create the illusion of choice.
A classic Ericksonian double bind sounds something like this. I don't know if you would prefer to enter trance now, with your eyes open, or in a few moments while you listen to my voice and your eyes comfortably close.
On the surface, I'm being given a choice. I have autonomy. The rebellious CEO says, I'll choose when to close my eyes. Thank you very much.
Exactly. The conscious mind is satisfied because it gets to evaluate options and make a decision, but the underlying presupposition embedded in the sentence that you are going to enter trance bypasses critical analysis completely. The CEO is so busy debating when and how it will happen that it forgets to debate if it will happen.
Then there is his use of ambiguity and embedded commands. This is where the syntax gets really twisted, right?
Erickson was famous for using incredibly convoluted, syntactically ambiguous sentences. He would say things like, and I don't know if you will learn this easily or if you will find that as you just relax, the learning happens automatically because you can know what you don't know you know.
Even just hearing that makes my brain stutter. I mean, what does that even mean?
That is the point. The working memory of the prefrontal cortex is desperately trying to parse the grammar, the double negatives, and the structural logic of the sentence. And while the CEO is distracted by solving the grammar puzzle, Erickson slips in an embedded command.
How does he embed the command without the CEO noticing?
He used a technique called analogical marking. While delivering that confusing sentence, he would create a subtle, nonverbal shift in his delivery on a specific action word. He might drop the pitch of his voice slightly or pause for a microsecond right before the word relax.
So the conscious mind is overloaded by the grammar, but the unconscious mind, the limbic system, picks up on the shift in tone and receives the isolated command. Relax.
It slips entirely undetected into the implicit processing pathways. The pupillometry data supports this. When subjects hear these ambiguous sentences, their pupils dilate maximally, indicating cognitive overload right at the exact moment the embedded command is delivered.
The analogy I use for the Milton model is that it's like keeping the security guard busy at the front desk. You hand the guard a massive, confusing clipboard full of complicated package delivery manifests. He's so focused on reading the clipboard and trying to find the errors that he doesn't notice the operatives quietly sneaking through the back door and changing the locks.
It is an elegant, highly calculated linguistic hacking of the brain's processing bandwidth.
So we've seen how deep the rabbit hole goes with language. We can use direct overload or covert ambiguity to bypass the CEO. But as we transition into the later chapters of the clinical manual, we have to ask a physical question. How deep can the brain actually go into these altered states? Because our sources venture into some territory that gets, frankly, incredibly esoteric.
We are plunging into the deep end now. The manual outlines the standard metric for measuring hypnotic depth, which is the Aaron's depth scale. It consists of 6 stages. Stage 1 is just light physical relaxation. As you move down the scale, the amnesia and physical control increase. Stage 6 is profound somnambulism.
Stage 6 is where you get those wild phenomena like negative hallucinations. A subject will literally not see a person standing right in front of them because the hypnotist told them the room was empty. It's also where you achieve full surgical anesthesia.
But the clinical manual claims the rabbit hole goes much deeper than stage 6. It introduces states of consciousness called the estadale and sequort states.
The S-Dale state, the manual calls this the hypnotic coma. What does that actually look like?
The estadale state is described as a condition of spontaneous, whole-body anesthesia and extreme, profound euphoria. The subject is so deeply relaxed that they often refuse to speak or respond to the hypnotist because the effort of moving their vocal cords feels like too much work.
Wow.
Interestingly, subjects in this state often exhibit a neurological phenomenon called waxy catalepsy.
Waxy catalepsy, meaning if the hypnotist physically lifts the subject's arm into the air and bends it into an awkward position, it just stays there. It remains suspended against gravity, completely frozen, without the subject consciously holding it up.
And beyond the ezidyl state is the Seykort state. The manual describes this as an absolute loss of all muscular tension combined with the onset of rapid eye movement, or REM. But crucially, the subject maintains waking auditory responsiveness.
Wait. They're experiencing REM sleep physiology. Their eyes are darting around under their lids, but they are awake and can hear the hypnotist.
That is the claim. And the manual goes even further. It states that if a patient is in these ultra-deep states, the hypnotist can use something called the Simpson protocol. In this protocol, the therapist doesn't even talk to the conscious mind. They communicate directly with what the manual calls the superconscious, using nonverbal finger, signaling the patient twitches a finger for yes or no to do content-free trauma work. The hypnotist supposedly doesn't even need to know what the trauma is to heal it.
Okay, I have to stop right here and push back hard. Superconscious. We started this deep dive talking about functional magnetic resonance imaging and voxel-based morphometry. Hard neuroscience. Now we are talking about a mystical, all-knowing entity in the brain that communicates through finger twitches. That sounds incredibly unscientific. What does the strategic research plan actually say about this?
The research plan absolutely drops the hammer on these concepts. It is merciless in its critique of this section of the manual.
I would imagine so.
The plan states unequivocally that superconscious is a mystical religious term, not a scientific one. It demands biometric validation for all of these claims. Regarding waxy catalepsy in the Isdale state, the plan demands EMG electromyography data.
Right, checking the muscles.
If an arm is suspended in the air, the muscle is contracted. If the conscious motor cortex isn't firing the command, what is happening at the neuromuscular junction? Is acetylcholine being released autonomously by lower brain centers to keep the muscle locked? Without EMG data, it is just an anecdote.
And what about the secret state and the RM phenomenon?
The research plan argues that it defies standard accepted sleep architecture. Normal REM sleep is triggered by PGO waves, pontogeniculo-occipital waves, originating in the brainstem. If a subject is in REM, how are those PGO waves being triggered without the subject cycling through the normal non-REM sleep stages first?
And the Simpson protocol. How does science explain the finger twitches if it isn't a superconscious talking?
The research plan provides a very grounded neurobiological hypothesis for that. It argues that the ideomotor finger signaling is not a higher spiritual entity. Instead, it is likely just the brain's implicit, non-declarative memory networks operating via the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia being the center for habit and motor control.
Right. Deeply repressed traumas often manifest as somatic bodily memories rather than verbal narratives. Because the prefrontal cortex, the language center, is completely decoupled in deep trance, the body expresses the stored trauma through tiny, involuntary motor pathways in the fingers. It is the basal ganglia processing implicit memory, not a mystical superconscious communicating secrets.
Science demanding the receipts. It is so necessary to keep this field grounded. But this brings up a really critical, highly practical point about trauma. When you are diving into these incredible deep states, manipulating the default mode network and uncovering implicit memories, sometimes things go violently wrong. What happens when deep repressed trauma surfaces uncontrollably during a session? The manual calls it a malignant aberration.
An aberration is simply an intense emotional release. When a repressed memory surfaces, crying or shaking can be highly therapeutic, but a malignant aberration is a severe neurobiological crisis. The research plan defines exactly what is happening chemically during one of these events.
Break down the chemistry of the crisis for us.
When the traumatic memory breaches the surface, the amygdala recognizes it as an immediate life-threatening event. It triggers an acute, massive spike in cortisol and norepinephrine. This chemical flood completely overwhelms the parasympathetic nervous system's buffering capacity.
The parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest side.
Yes. And its primary neurotransmitter for calming the body is acetylcholine. Under normal stress, acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors in the heart to slow your heart rate down and put the brakes on panic. But during a malignant aberration, the flood of norepinephrine is so massive that the biological brake pedal just snaps off.
So the security alarm doesn't just ring, it locks the doors and floods the building.
Exactly. The amygdala completely hijacks the prefrontal cortex. The CEO is locked out of the building. The patient isn't just remembering the trauma. Neurochemically, their brain is literally reliving it in the present moment. They lose all orientation to the safety of the therapist's office.
Managing that kind of severe neurochemical hijack, obviously requires a highly trained professional to safely reorient the patient. But as we move into our final section, the sources actually provide a really powerful, grounded self-regulation technique that you, the listener, can use right now if you ever feel your own amygdala starting to hijack your system in daily life.
It's an incredibly practical tool called the Betty Erickson technique.
DIY brain hacking. Betty Erickson was Milton Erickson's wife, and she was a brilliant practitioner in her own right. She developed this 3-2-1 protocol for self-hypnosis and managing daily anxiety, panic attacks, or even severe insomnia. Let's walk the listener through how to actually execute it.
The protocol is elegantly simple. You sit quietly, keep your eyes open, and you systematically acknowledge 3 things you can currently see in your environment, 3 things you can hear, and 3 things you can physically feel.
So if I'm having a panic attack, I force myself to say, I see the lamp on the desk, I see the crack in the window, I see the pattern in the rug, I hear the hum of the air conditioner, I hear a car driving by outside, I hear the sound of my own breath, I feel the weight of my body in the chair, I feel my feet flat on the floor, I feel the fabric of my shirt on my arms.
Exactly. You acknowledge them slowly and deliberately. Then you immediately repeat the cycle, but you drop the number to 2. 2 new things you see, 2 new things you hear, 2 new things you feel, and then finally, 1 of each.
It sounds almost too simple, like a basic grounding exercise. But based on everything we have covered today, the neurocognitive mechanism behind why it works is brilliant.
It perfectly synthesizes everything we've talked about.
Yeah.
By forcing your conscious mind to rapidly scan your environment, identify highly mundane, boring objects, and verbalize that sensory data across multiple modalities, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, you are systematically taxing the working memory capacity of your prefrontal cortex.
It is the ultimate application of the Elman number block, but you are doing it to yourself. You are essentially giving your own CEO a gentle, highly controlled DDS attack. You overload the prefrontal cortex with so much safe, mundane, boring data that the amygdala, the security alarm, is forced to realize there is absolutely no active threat in the environment.
And because the brain demands internal consistency, when the amygdala receives overwhelming evidence that the environment is safe, it stops pumping norepinephrine. The acetylcholine can finally do its job. The body is forced to downregulate into a parasympathetic state of rest and digest.
You are using top-down cognitive focus to force a bottom-up physiological relaxation. It is a perfect neurological feedback loop.
It empowers the individual to take control of their own neuroplasticity right in the moment.
So let's recap this incredible journey. You are the architect of your own brain. You are not stuck with the hardware you were born with, and you are not a victim of a static operating system. You can use the passive, bottom-up practice of mindfulness meditation to literally, physically thicken your prefrontal cortex, increase your cognitive processing power, and shrink the volume of your fear-processing amygdala over time. You can build a stronger, calmer, more resilient brain.
And you can use the active top-down mechanics of hypnosis, whether through direct induction or conversational linguistics, to instantly rewire your functional networks in real time. You can mute your inner critic, decouple your default mode network, and take direct conscious control of how your body experiences pain and emotion.
It really is neurological muddy waters, but in the most empowering way possible. The software rewrites the hardware, and the fortified hardware runs better software. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder based on everything we've uncovered about how easily the brain can be hacked.
We have spent this entire deep dive talking about how powerful these tools are in a clinical therapeutic setting.
Right. But if our thoughts, our expectations, and where we direct our visual and auditory focus can literally reshape our brain matter and override our nervous system in a matter of minutes, what does that mean for our everyday lives? Specifically, what does that mean for our modern passive scrolling and our constant media consumption?
That is a deeply unsettling yet profound question to ask.
If a simple linguistic double-bind or rapid state switch utilizing metabolic fatigue is all it takes to induce a trance state, bypass your critical faculty, and plant a suggestion deep in your limbic system, are we constantly living under a form of low-grade accidental hypnosis? Are the highly engineered algorithms that we stare at on our smartphones all day acting as digital hypnotists? Are they using rapid state switching and sensory overload to slowly remodel our neuroplastic hardware without us even realizing it?
If the brain is continually rewiring itself based on experience, we have to be ruthlessly protective of what experiences we are feeding it.
Because whether you are downloading a new operating system on purpose to heal yourself, or you are blindly letting malware run in the background while you scroll, your hardware is being rewritten every single day. The choice is simply whether you want to be the programmer or the program. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, protect your attention, and take care of your hardware.